It was the second night of a quiet camp tucked deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. Echo Pines, they called it, a modest sleepaway retreat built on old logging land with 6 cabins, 1 mess hall, and no cell reception for miles. That year, the summer of 1997, Camp Echo Pines had just 37 kids enrolled for Session 1. Most came from Minneapolis, a few from out of state. 5 of them, Brett, Kayla, Josh, Morgan, and Tyler, were all assigned to Cabin B. They didn't know each other before camp started, but they clicked fast. The kind of fast only possible between kids thrown into the same strange woods, away from home. That second night, after the fire circle and marshmallows, counselors called lights out at 9:30. One of them, Jake Dorman, 19 at the time, remembers seeing all 5 kids in their bunks. Morgan had asked for a flashlight. Brett had left his boots outside to dry. They seemed normal, tired, and even laughing. By 10:15, the whole camp was quiet. At least, that's what the staff believed. By morning, everything changed. It was the cabin leader, Lily Martinez, who first noticed. She'd gone to wake the kids for breakfast at 7:05 a.m. The door was still latched from the inside, but when she stepped in, 4 beds were empty. 1 mattress, Tyler's, looked like it had never been slept in. She assumed they were in the bathroom, or had woken up early and gone to the mess hall. But 10 minutes later, when they still hadn't shown up, and no one in the camp had seen them, not even the cook or the maintenance guy, she raised the alarm. Jake, Lily, and 2 other counselors checked the woods behind the cabin. There were no footprints, no snapped twigs. The trail down to the lake was undisturbed. The boots Brett left out were still there, damp from dew. Kayla's jacket was folded under her pillow. A single granola bar, half open, sat on Josh's bunk. Nothing indicated a rushed escape. Nothing indicated a struggle. And most notably, there were no signs that anyone had come in or out. By 9 a.m., camp staff had called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived by 10:30, along with 1 bloodhound team from the nearest town, about 40 miles south. The dog picked up a scent near the edge of the tree line, and then nothing. The trail just stopped. No boot prints, no tire marks, no broken branches, just forest. The camp was placed on lockdown. Parents were called. The other campers were sent home. Interviews began. But every child and every counselor gave the same answers. No one saw the kids leave. No one heard a thing. Cabin B had only 1 door, no windows wide enough to crawl through, and was within view of the counselor cabin, yet no one saw movement past 10 p.m. That night. And the door had still been latched from the inside when Lily opened it. By that afternoon, the sheriff declared the 5 children officially missing. The search operation started within the hour. Rangers swept the area on foot. Helicopters were called in from Duluth. Divers scanned the lake. A mile-wide perimeter was mapped out. Dozens of volunteers arrived with flashlights and radios, but by sunset, there was still no sign of the missing 5. The following morning, search dogs were deployed again. They couldn't find a single scent trail past the camp's perimeter. Camp Echo Pines became a swarm of flashing lights, yellow tape, reporters, and unanswered questions. Officials combed through background checks, staff records, and camper logs. Nothing flagged. No one on staff had a criminal record. No reports of strange vehicles. No missing equipment. And no calls had been made from the camp phone that night. Within 3 days, the case had hit the national news. One by one, the parents arrived, some silent, some frantic, all hollowed out. They walked the woods themselves, retraced the trails, called out their children's names until their voices broke. But the forest gave nothing back. Camp Echo Pines officially shut down on day 5. The cabins were locked. The grounds were sealed. By then, the search had turned desperate. Conspiracy theories emerged. Wolves, a rogue survivalist, human trafficking. None of them fit. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses, just 5 kids gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. 28 years later, those names, Brett Nolan, Kayla Diaz, Josh Teller, Morgan Lenz, and Tyler Reeves, still linger like echoes in that forest. But back in 1997, no one knew how deep the silence would go, and no one was ready for what would, much later, finally be found, sealed inside a place no one even knew existed. The first 48 hours after the children disappeared were treated like a race against the wilderness. By noon that day, The county sheriff had called in 2 K-9 units from St. Louis County, a helicopter from the state patrol, and a dive team to begin checking the lake that curved just east of the camp. The thinking, early on, was simple. 5 kids had somehow wandered off, possibly gotten turned around, possibly gotten hurt. The idea that someone had taken them, all 5, didn't seem possible. Not in a place like this, not in the middle of a forest with no road for 6 miles. But the search didn't turn up what it should have. The dogs couldn't track beyond the tree line. The water team found no clothing, no disturbance, no footprints in the mud. Rangers mapped out a 4-mile grid and began walking it in tight lines, each man within shouting distance of the next. They brought in thermal drones, rattled food in metal bowls, played parent voice recordings on portable speakers. They checked the shallow caves and ravines. They found nothing, not even broken branches. That night, the weather dropped to 46 degrees. Rain came in around 2 a.m. and muddied whatever tracks had been left, if there were any to begin with. By day 3, search operations expanded. Volunteers were bussed in from 3 counties. They slept in tents or on cots inside the sealed-off mess hall. Locals cooked food in shifts. One man drove up from Duluth just to hand out flashlights. Former rangers returned with their own dogs. 4 horses were brought in to cover steep, uneven terrain. A few of them refused to move in a narrow draw about 2 miles east. One of the K-9s reportedly went still in the same spot. But again, no scent, no debris, no visual clues. The media picked up the story by day 4. Local news reporters hovered near the gate. Some were let in under supervision. Parents gave quiet interviews. Others refused to speak. One mother broke down during a press conference and had to be carried back to her car. Reporters pounced on every theory. A mountain lion dragged the kids off, a rogue counselor, a backwoods cult. People called in with tips about sightings as far away as Wisconsin. None of them held. By day 5, the sheriff stopped using the word lost and started saying taken. That same morning, the camp director, a man named Dennis Callahan, 61 years old and in his 15th year running Echo Pines, collapsed on the trail during a second sweep of the lakeside bluff. Witnesses say he kept muttering, "I checked the doors. I checked the doors." He was airlifted to the nearest hospital with signs of exhaustion and severe dehydration. He never returned to the camp again. A private security firm offered drones. The National Guard provided additional aerial sweeps. A grid the size of Manhattan was eventually cleared. Over 230 personnel had participated in the search by day 10. Still, no sign of the 5 kids. At the center of the investigation was one disturbing fact that no one could get around. If the children had walked off on their own, someone should have heard them. They would have left trails, especially at night, even if they panicked, even if they split up, even if they tried to hide. They were kids. There should have been a trace, but there wasn't. No boot prints, no hair, no clothing snagged on branches. Their bags were still in their bunks, their toothbrushes untouched. Theories began turning darker. Some claimed an outsider had hiked in and taken them, though no one saw any sign of intrusion. Others believed they had drowned, but their shoes were dry and the lake showed no signs. A more extreme theory began circulating among locals, that the land itself was cursed, that the kids had been lifted from the air. A phrase the sheriff's deputy would later admit had first been said quietly by one of the K-9 handlers, frustrated and shaken after a 4th day of failed scent trails. "Like they were lifted from the air," he muttered. That phrase stuck. It became the unofficial name for the case among locals. By day 12, the operation wound down. The cost, the manpower, the failure, it was beginning to feel impossible. Officers remained, but the large-scale sweep was over. The camp was shuttered permanently. Fences were locked. The grounds were declared unsafe. The lawsuits followed. 3 families filed jointly against Camp Echo Pines and its parent company, citing negligence. Investigations were launched into staff records, hiring procedures, supervision ratios. Though nothing illegal was found, nothing felt clean anymore. And nothing, no search, no theory, no expert, could answer the one question everyone was too afraid to ask out loud. How could 5 children disappear without leaving anything behind? The forest had been eaten alive by the search. Trees trampled, paths ruined, silence left in place of answers. And for those who'd been there, one thing remained unbearable. The sense that the kids were still out there, not lost, not buried, just unseen. Years would pass before anyone got close again. And even then, no one expected what had been hiding, not just in the woods, but underneath them. After the search was officially called off, most of the families were told the same thing. There would still be patrols. The investigation was open, but no one should get their hopes up. The sheriff used terms like ongoing and limited resources. A few parents stayed in town for weeks, renting cheap motel rooms, retracing trails, handing out flyers even when there were no more cars to give them to. But by the end of that first summer, most had returned to their cities, jobs, lives they didn't recognize anymore. Some tried therapy, others went silent, and some never left the woods. Bill Menard was one of them. His daughter Morgan had been the youngest of the 5, 9 years old. She still had a baby tooth loose in the front when she went to Camp Echo Pines. She'd picked it herself after seeing a brochure at a school fair. The first night, she'd called him to collect from the lodge office. She told him her bunk smelled weird and asked if birds ever get lost in trees. He told her to hang her socks in the sun and to write him a letter, even though he knew she probably wouldn't. When Morgan disappeared, Bill came up from Bloomington and didn't go back. He set up a small trailer near the edge of the forest, about a half-mile from where the old camp road was chained off. He got permission from the landowner by trading labor, clearing brush, patching fence lines. He took a job at a local hardware store, worked 3 days a week, and spent the other 4 walking the woods alone with a GPS and a notebook. His maps weren't just hand-drawn. He layered them, used old survey records. He traced old ranger paths from the 1960s, flagged every known trail, cave mouth, and dry creek bed within a 10-mile radius. He built a database, names, times, sightings, weather patterns. He cataloged the disappearances that came before and after. He spoke with locals who claimed to have heard cries in the trees or seen flashes of light near the bluffs. Most of it led nowhere, but he logged everything. The locals got used to seeing him. Everyone just called him the dad in the trailer. He was quiet, polite, but there was a hard edge behind his eyes. He didn't care what people believed. In 2001, when a pair of teenagers went missing briefly on an off-grid trail and were found 12 hours later disoriented and barefoot, Bill was the first to speak to them. He said their story matched a pattern: lost time, blank spots in memory, and a sense of being watched from behind. The kids later recanted, said they were just scared and high, but Bill marked it down anyway. In 2004, 7 years after the Echo Pines disappearance, Bill brought something to the sheriff's office. It was a mini DV tape shot with a handheld camcorder from the late 90s. The footage was shaky, nearly all darkness, but for 3 seconds there was movement on the ridgeline near the eastern slope. A figure, tall and human-shaped, stepping out of view. Bill had been filming an old overhang where he'd left granola bars days earlier, hoping wildlife would come. Instead, he believed he caught a man, or someone, watching the trail. The sheriff reviewed the footage. Deputies looked. One of them suggested it was just a bear upright or a hiker off trail. Another said it could have been Bill's own shadow. They told him it wasn't enough to reopen anything. But Bill doubled down. He said the figure was standing still. He said it was too tall. He said it wasn't a guess. It was a confirmation. That year, Bill started sleeping with a motion-activated camera pointed at the woods behind his trailer. He left out water jugs, tarps, and flashlights in marked places with "Take if you're alive" written in marker on duct tape. He checked every object daily. Some nights he swore something had shifted. Other nights, nothing. By 2006, his neighbors said he spoke less. His beard grew long. He rarely left the tree line. He stopped going into town except for supplies. A local store clerk said he seemed more forgetful. Another said he'd started talking about maps being off, that satellite maps were being altered. He became obsessed with the idea of a structure buried beneath the hills, camouflaged, never on record. People assumed grief had finally broken him, that he'd become like the others, parents who chased ghosts because the alternative was unbearable. But he never gave up, not even when his trailer was vandalized in 2009. Not when local teens left signs mocking him, not even when his health declined and he began walking slower, with a limp. Because he believed something man-made was hiding out there, not an animal, not the forest, something built and hidden, by someone who understood the land far better than the people who'd searched it. Years later, long after most had forgotten the camp's name, Bill's maps and notes would be found locked in a metal trunk beneath his cot, and in one of those maps, near the bottom corner, circled 3 times in red, was a ridge no one had ever searched, the same ridge explorers would break into almost 2 decades later. By 2012, the Echo Pines case had all but faded from public memory. The camp was long closed, its wooden cabins half collapsed under moss and rot. The sheriff who ran the original investigation had retired. The parents had either passed, moved, or stopped speaking to the press altogether. Even the local teens who used to dare each other to visit the old campsite had moved on. It was a cold case, colder than most, and it likely would have stayed that way if not for a podcast that aired in September of that year. The podcast was called Second Day Lost. It focused on disappearances that didn't make sense, cases where search teams had found nothing, where people vanished from trails they knew well, where the timeline didn't hold. The host, Nora Fields, was a former investigative reporter who had spent the last 5 years digging into regional anomalies using public records and old ranger files. Echo Pines came across her radar not because of the kids, but because of a 1976 disappearance involving a bow hunter who'd vanished less than 5 miles from the future camp's location. His truck had been parked neatly, gear missing, no footprints, just gone. That was the start. By the 3rd episode, Nora had found 11 more vanishings in the same region. Not high numbers, not statistically alarming, but odd. All isolated, all on foot, all with 0 evidence left behind. Most were considered wilderness losses, bad weather, injury, hypothermia. But none had ever been found. No bodies, no gear, no clues. The episodes gained traction, and soon listeners began sending in their own findings. One of them was Gina Haskell. Gina wasn't a journalist. She was a freelance web developer and amateur blogger based out of Duluth. But she had an obsession with forestry maps and satellite overlays, a side hobby that had started when she got lost on a solo hike at 22 and never fully got over it. For years, she'd collected archived logging maps, ranger dispatch notes, and old cartography records scanned into public files. When she listened to the Echo Pines episode, something clicked. She pulled every recorded disappearance from a 50-mile radius and began plotting the coordinates onto a private map database. What emerged wasn't random. It was curved, a crescent-shaped band stretching nearly 20 miles wide, arcing northeast to southwest across the forest zone. It curved around what had once been a dense cluster of 1930s logging roads, roads that hadn't appeared on state maps since the 1970s. Inside that curve, Camp Echo Pines, directly in the center. She looked further. Each point, hiker, camper, bow hunter, even a fire spotter who'd vanished off a tower trail, sat within half a mile of an old route that no longer technically existed. And there was more. Every single case had involved a person traveling alone or in a small group, unarmed, with no GPS. They'd all gone missing on foot. No one had ever seen vehicles. No one had ever heard screams. To Gina, that meant someone had used those roads, someone who knew the terrain better than any modern ranger, someone who didn't need marked trails, someone who had deliberately chosen their targets and had a method for disappearing with them entirely. She published her findings in a 5-part blog series titled The Disappearance Map. At first, it barely registered, a few shares, a local news mention. Then, it caught the attention of a former wilderness guide, who confirmed that several of the trails Gina had flagged were ghost routes, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Another reader pointed out that 2 of the logging roads aligned with Cold War-era infrastructure plans for a temporary ranger post that was never completed, one that had been proposed underground due to fire risk. That's when Gina's theory shifted. If someone had been using the terrain for decades, they likely weren't living in the open. The climate, the remoteness, it would have been unsustainable. But underground, in old bunkers, sealed cellars, reinforced root cellars built during the Depression, that was possible. She started to believe the children hadn't just been taken into the forest. They'd been taken beneath it. She called it the buried room theory. It proposed that somewhere near the crescent's apex, near the ridge just east of Echo Pines, There was a structure not marked on any current map. Something man-made, with insulation, hidden by elevation, time, and vegetation. She posted blueprints of known WPA structures from the 1930s. She created overlays showing how rain runoff might have hidden ground-level openings. She compared post-1970 aerial photos and found one dark patch, irregular, dense, and unmapped. One reader recognized it immediately. It matched the same area Bill Menard had circled on his hand-drawn maps, a ridge where he claimed to have seen movement in 2004. By late 2012, Gina had drawn attention from online forums, amateur sleuths, and even a retired detective who worked the case back in '97. He asked to meet her. She brought her laptop and 3 printed maps. He brought a notebook. She told him she believed the kids never left the woods because they were never meant to be seen again, that someone, or something, had built a place to hold them, and no one had ever looked in the right direction. The detective asked her one question. If it's there, how do we find it? And she gave him one word, ridge. The same ridge where everything would finally break open 13 years later. By the time Gina Haskell published her 6th article, Echo Pines and the Ridge That Doesn't Map, she'd been contacted by dozens of amateur researchers, conspiracy theorists, former campers, even a man who claimed to have been followed while hiking that same stretch of woods back in the '80s. Most messages were easy to dismiss, but one stood out. It was from someone who didn't offer a theory, only a location. The sender identified himself as Nate Carlson. I'm 34 years old. Former firefighter. Now part of an informal crew of off-grid explorers who hiked old ranger trails and mapped ruins from abandoned forestry cabins. Their hobby wasn't new. They'd been documenting dilapidated lookout stations and buried outposts for years, usually just out of fascination. Nate told her they had a growing database of forgotten WPA structures, the same type Gina had cross-referenced in her disappearance theory. But he said they had found one site that didn't match any public records, and it wasn't on any map. He called it Site 22. According to Nate, Site 22 sat on the north face of the ridge Gina had flagged in her crescent theory, almost exactly at the point where Bill Menard had recorded the figure on his mini DV tape in 2004. They'd first come across it while tracking a disused firebreak road last maintained in 1959. What they found wasn't a cabin exactly. It was a formation of rock, but with straight edges, too precise. A rectangular seam cut into the stone, 10 feet wide. Nate believed it had once been a reinforced entrance, later sealed with concrete and rubble, likely dynamited shut. At first glance, it just looked like part of the hillside. But their photos told another story. Subtle scoring marks, cracked iron rods embedded at the edges, and what appeared to be a rusted hinge on the lower right. Gina met them 2 weeks later. She drove up with a weatherproof notebook, a map marked with 6 red circles, and a handheld scanner. The 4 men, Nate, Joel, Marcus, and Eli, had gear, footage, and caution. They weren't treasure hunters. They weren't looking for ghosts. What they believed, based on the layout and slope, was that the entrance led somewhere. Possibly a root cellar, possibly an old storm shelter, maybe even an incomplete ranger substation never brought to code. What made them reach out was something Nate found in an archival copy of a 1931 logging ledger, a handwritten line beside coordinates only a few miles off the ridge. Secondary cabin marked for lock seal, notify Granger post upon burial. The word burial had been underlined. None of them knew what Granger post meant. But Gina did. She remembered from her earlier research, Ellis Granger had been a forest warden from the late 1980s to 1999, known for pushing unauthorized trail closures and maintaining remote structures without documentation. He was never publicly linked to the Echo Pines case. But internal notes from ranger logs indicated he'd requested access to survey land near the same ridge 3 separate times, once in 1991, again in '93, and a final time in 1997. That last date, only weeks before the children vanished. Gina started digging through historical aerial photos, not satellite, actual aerial flyovers, the kind taken for logging records and erosion tracking. She found one from 1982, one from 1994, and one archived by a fire tower unit in 2001. She overlaid the three. Trees had shifted, clearings had expanded, but there was something in all of them, just barely, that didn't make sense. A shadow. It appeared only at a certain hour, in a certain month. A dark rectangular void cast across a narrow clearing just south of Site 22. In 1982, it was sharp. By 1994, it had softened, overgrown. In 2001, it was nearly gone, but still there if you knew where to look. Gina measured it. 15 feet long, 4 feet wide. Not a tree, not a trench. A man-made depression, the kind cast by something low and flat, something like a roof, half buried. She showed it to the retired detectives she'd interviewed back in 2012, one of whom had worked Echo Pines in his early career. The men didn't say much, but after 30 minutes of silence and a second round of coffee, one of them agreed to drive out. Quietly, no press, no notice to local law enforcement, just to see if what she was describing could be real. They made the trip that October. No trail led directly to the clearing. It was a 4-hour bushwhack uphill, half on crumbling deer paths, half on old switchbacks barely wide enough to stand on. The forest had reclaimed almost everything. But when they arrived, there it was. The same rock face, the same overhang, the same odd seam running down its edge. One of the detectives ran his hand along the wall, stopped, and pointed. Embedded in the concrete, nearly invisible under moss, was a rusted bolt, shaped like a locking pin. They camped one night nearby. Gina took soil samples. Nate flew a drone with ground-penetrating radar. And on the edge of the clearing, half buried under leaves, they found the corner of a timber beam sticking out of the earth, rotten but squared. Artificial. Not from any known cabin site. What they didn't know yet, what none of them could have guessed, was that beneath that beam, below that slab of stone, lay a hidden network sealed decades ago. And inside, preserved in dry air and darkness, was the beginning of everything they thought had been lost. All they had to do now was find a way in. By October of 2025, the forest around Echo Pines had grown nearly impassable. Narrow service roads were washed out, trailheads were either unmarked or erased by storms, and the canopy was so thick in places that GPS lost signal for hours at a time. The team, Gina, Nate, Joel, Eli, and the 2 retired detectives, loaded supplies for 4 days and agreed to go light on announcements. No media, no permits, just a hike in, and hopefully something solid to bring back out. They moved slowly. No clear trail led to the ridge. Nate had marked a route that zigzagged across old firebreak lines, long since absorbed by the undergrowth. It took them nearly 2 full days just to reach the clearing, the place where the rectangular shadow had first appeared in those layered aerials. When they arrived, it looked almost identical to the photo from 1982. A depression in the slope, scattered with mossy timber and angled rock. At first glance, it still resembled nothing more than a geological oddity, but they had learned how to look deeper. On the 3rd morning, just after sunrise, Joel circled wide and called out softly. 30 yards downhill, nearly hidden under pine needles and lichen, was a low structure, a log shell, maybe 20 feet long, sunken slightly into the ground. Not a modern cabin. The logs were weathered, too old to date by sight alone. Ivy twisted up the sides. The roof was partially caved in, but the outer door was still intact, reinforced with a rusted crossbar sealed from the outside. There were no windows, no nameplate. No signs of recent entry. They unlatched the bar and opened it slowly. Inside was cold air, dry rot, and silence. The structure had no furniture, just shelves on one side, metal brackets on the walls, maybe for tools or supplies. On the far end, behind an overturned bench, was a square in the floor, not a carpet, not a hatch, a trap door, steel-rimmed, bolted. Gina filmed quietly, her hands trembling. She didn't speak. No one did. They removed the bolt. The trap door lifted easier than expected. Underneath was a narrow staircase carved into compacted earth and supported by timber beams. Dry air poured out, stale like old paper and stone. A dead silence followed, as if even the birds had stopped. One by one, they descended. It was colder below. The staircase led to a narrow corridor about 5 feet wide, barely tall enough for Nate to stand upright. The walls were lined with plywood sheeting. The floor was dirt. They counted 14 steps before it leveled out into a chamber roughly the size of a school classroom. Their headlamps caught outlines of old furniture, a desk, a chair on its side, what looked like a cot frame. Metal hooks hung from the ceiling rafters. On the far wall, scratches, vertical lines deep and irregular, some of them overlapping. Not initials, not carvings, just gouges. No one spoke. Then Gina turned slowly to the left. There, behind a warped bookcase, was another door. Smaller. Wood. Padlocked, but the latch was loose, likely rusted through. Nate pried it open. The smell changed, something dry but heavier. The room beyond had no floorboards, only packed soil, covered in straw and decayed cloth. But what caught everyone's breath was what lay in the center, a pair of children's shoes, untied, small, caked in dust. Gina dropped to her knees. One still had a name written on the inside tongue, faded ink barely visible. It read, Morgan. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what they had just entered was no storage bunker. This had been lived in, used, sealed. The temperature underground had helped preserve parts of it. On one shelf sat cans, soup, beans, fruit, all expired but intact. A camping lantern, a stack of books, a tin mug with a spoon still inside it. Joel, in the back, found a shallow closet space. Taped to the inside wall were 3 sheets of paper, crayon markings, childlike. Figures drawn with round heads and stick limbs. One of them had 5 figures. One was smaller, crossed out with a red X. They searched in silence for nearly 2 hours, filmed everything, documented angles, time-stamped notes, no bones, no clothing beyond the shoes. But the structure went deeper, a passage barely 3 feet wide extending into darkness. They didn't follow it yet, not without backup. But even without going further, one thing was certain. The rumors of a buried room weren't just theories anymore. It was real, and someone had built it to be invisible. As they climbed back up into the surface light, no one spoke for several minutes. The forest sounded louder now, wind, creaking branches, distant birds. Eli, still standing by the trap door, broke the silence with only 5 words. Quiet. Almost a whisper. We're not the first ones down here. They sealed it again, not to hide it, but to preserve it until authorities could return. Gina looked out across the clearing, still recording. For years, it had just been a shadow in an old photograph, but now it was something else entirely. A doorway into the missing time. And it had finally been opened. They returned 2 days later with backup. A forensic consultant, 2 Park Service officials, and a crime scene photographer who had volunteered out of personal interest. He'd grown up less than 20 miles from Camp Echo Pines and remembered the headlines. The trapdoor was opened under state supervision this time, carefully logged, measured, and documented. The team descended in full gear. Nothing had been disturbed since the first entry. But this time, they were ready to go further. Beyond the main chamber, the narrow passage they'd found, the one that vanished into blackness, was the focus. They followed it. It led to another door. Wooden frame, reinforced with metal, swollen with age but intact. The handle had been removed. They used a pry bar, moving slow, making sure not to damage what was on the other side. When the door finally opened, it hit against padding. The walls inside were lined floor to ceiling with thick soundproof foam, the kind used in old recording studios or psychiatric isolation rooms. None of them had expected that. This was no survival bunker. This had been made for silence. Inside the room were no windows, no vents, just stale, dry air that pressed against the lungs. At the far end was a curved alcove with 5 small cots arranged in a semicircle, child-sized, rusted frames, each with what remained of thin blankets, long decayed. In the center of the room, a broken tape recorder sat half buried in dust. Beside it, 5 plastic spoons, a cracked plastic cup, and a battery-powered lantern with a shattered bulb. Everything smelled faintly of mold and rusted metal. Then they saw the wall. On the left side, under a strip of the decayed foam, were prints, small palms, children's hands dipped in red marker or maybe paint, pressed against the wall in uneven rows, some smeared, one with what looked like fingernail scratches through the center. No names. Just the outline of where they had been, Like a roll call never answered. The silence in the room was total. Everyone felt it. No echo, no footfall noise. Just the hum of their own breathing in their ears. Eli found the notebook. It was lodged under the fourth cot, wrapped in an old sweater sleeve. The cover was water damaged, the pages warped, but the ink was still legible. Inside were fragments, uneven handwriting likely from a child, days without dates, names written and rewritten. Morgan made us laugh today. Brett said we'll get out. Tyler still cries when the light goes out. Then, near the final page, a line that no one could explain. He says quiet is safer. And below it, underlined twice. Still here, still waiting. The page was dated July 2nd, 1998, 14 months after the 5 kids had vanished. That entry alone changed everything. One of the detectives sat down against the wall. Gina stayed crouched near the tape recorder. She didn't touch it, just stared at it. There were no cassette tapes left inside. But when Nate began inspecting the far wall behind the cots, his flashlight caught a strange line in the paneling, not a crack, a separation. He pressed gently. The wall shifted. Behind the foam and plywood was a cavity. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, was an 8mm film reel. No label, just dust, and a faint smell of oil and decay. The room went still again. Nate passed it to the forensic tech, who sealed it in a bag immediately. At surface level, the ranger team logged every item. Soil samples were taken from beneath the cots. The notebook and film were preserved under chain of custody. But no remains were found. No evidence of death, only absence. The presence of soundproofing changed the conversation entirely. Whoever built this had intended not just to hide people, but to silence them. No screams, no echoes, no chance of being heard. The cots suggested long-term habitation. The children's drawings, the spoons, the journal entries, all proof they had been alive well after the world assumed they were gone. They hadn't vanished without a trace. They'd been buried alive in silence. As the team packed up for exfil, one of the forensic officials stayed behind at the threshold. He stared into the padded room for nearly 5 minutes, unmoving. When asked later what he was thinking, he answered without hesitation. It wasn't just soundproofed for quiet. It was made to hold guilt. Gina didn't sleep that night. She stayed in a tent near the ridge clearing, her laptop open, reviewing every frame from the footage they'd captured. She kept returning to one still, the row of cots, all empty. The spoons are still on the floor, and in the corner of the shot, barely visible in the dust on the wall, a single word drawn in a shaky child's hand, now half erased. Why? The 8mm reel would need to be developed, and what it held, no one could predict. But in that moment, what mattered most wasn't the film. It was what the room confirmed. They hadn't disappeared. They had been taken, hidden, and kept, long after the searches ended, long after the world gave up, long enough for someone to try to erase even the sound of their voices. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the story of those 5 missing kids was no longer just a mystery. It was a secret finally starting to speak. It took 5 days to get the reel processed. The lab they contacted didn't ask questions, at least not at first. Just told Gina it would require special handling due to the film's age and potential fragility. The metal canister was corroded but sealed, which had likely helped preserve the footage. They drove it down themselves, avoiding commercial transport. A private film archivist, someone who had previously restored Cold War training footage and lost war documentaries, was brought in to handle the transfer. No digital tampering, no enhancement, just raw playback. The reel measured just under 4 minutes. They watched it in silence. The first frames were dark, flickering. Grain clouded the center, but then it cleared, dim lighting. A concrete wall padded with soundproofing foam, the corner of the room, the same one they'd stood in weeks earlier. The camera was static, placed on something low. No movement at first. Then, from the edge of the frame, children began to appear. One by one. 5 in total. It was them. Brett, Kayla, Josh, Tyler, Morgan. Each of them looked thinner than in their camp photos. Hair matted, clothes oversized, like they'd been worn too long without change. They weren't panicking. Not crying. They were quiet, eerily so. Moving slowly, deliberately, like they had been given instructions. They each held a book, not children's books, manuals. One looked like an old forestry guide, another, a religious pamphlet. The pages were dog-eared, but they clutched them like assignments. Then the voice entered. Not visible, not urgent, just calm, male, monotone with a slight distortion, like recorded playback through a speaker too close to the mic. It asked the children to begin. They did. One by one, they recited phrases as if from memory. No one is coming. You belong here now. Quiet means safe. Each child repeated the line in order. The cadence was unnatural, memorized but stripped of emotion. Except Morgan. She didn't say anything. She sat still on the cot, her hands gripping the blanket. When the voice asked again, the camera shook. Not as if it had fallen, more like someone had jostled it in frustration. The screen blurred, then realigned. The next shot jumped. Now the children were lined up near the far wall, staring forward. One of them had tear tracks visible, but made no sound. The tape had no audio during the stretch, just the image. 5 kids standing still, hands at their sides, facing the wall like they were waiting for instruction. Then another jump. Only 4 kids now. Morgan was gone. The remaining children weren't crying. They weren't looking at the camera anymore. They were sitting in silence, heads low. Josh, barely 10 years old when he vanished, rocked slightly, but didn't speak. The camera stayed fixed for another 30 seconds. Then, a final movement, the hand of an adult entering the frame briefly, placing something on the floor. It looked like a bowl. Then the reel ended. Gina didn't speak for over a minute. The room was still. One of the retired detectives stood up and left the building entirely. The archivist, normally composed, stepped out to smoke a cigarette. No one said it aloud, but it was clear what they had witnessed. Proof that the children had been held, that they had been controlled, and that at least one of them, Morgan, had resisted. The identity of the voice remained unknown. The team replayed the audio segment, digitally cleaned it, and enhanced the low frequencies. The distortion was consistent with analog tape layered over prior recordings. Someone had used old equipment to hide their identity. But the calmness in the tone, the absence of anger, of urgency, was what disturbed them most. It didn't sound like rage or fear. It sounded like belief, like the speaker thought this was right. The phrases used were noted and compared with known conditioning tactics from cults, isolationist groups, and military psychological operations. None were a perfect match, but the messaging, "You belong here now, no one is coming," lined up with long-term captivity doctrine. Subtle emotional erosion meant to erase the idea of rescue. The bigger question remained, what happened to Morgan? There was no follow-up footage, no second reel. Nothing in the underground room had pointed to a camera, but the position of the tape recorder was found on the floor, and the way the camera stayed fixed, someone had documented what happened down there, intentionally, like a logbook no one was ever meant to find. And the gaps, those silent clipped cuts between scenes, suggested that someone had edited the reel, which meant someone had planned to show it or use it or hide it. But they never finished the job. They left it behind, like the shoes, like the handprints, like the cots that stayed perfectly lined even after 30 years of rot. The film was handed over to state investigators within the week. A federal agency requested copies soon after, but the original reel stayed sealed in evidence, tagged, time-stamped, locked behind a reinforced chain of custody. There was no denying the footage anymore. The children had been alive, had been kept alive, and the world had gone on thinking they were lost in the trees. But they had been below the forest the entire time, watching, waiting, whispering into a silence designed to break them. And yet Morgan had resisted. She had broken the cycle. She had vanished again, this time from inside a prison no one knew existed. And now, for the first time, they had to ask, what if she made it out? The voice on the reel had been distorted, but not beyond recovery. It carried a subtle rhythm, a tonal shape that forensic audio specialists could isolate. Over the next 3 weeks, a linguistics profiler ran it through vocal match databases tied to state and federal personnel records. It didn't match anyone currently active in law enforcement or forestry, but buried inside a forgotten digital archive of 1990s ranger station tapes, someone recognized a pattern. In 1995, a ranger named Ellis Granger had recorded over a dozen wildlife observation tapes for the Department of Natural Resources. On them, he narrated animal behavior for training use. Most were dull: dates, wind direction, elk migration data, but the cadence was unmistakable. The match came back with 91% vocal probability. When they added distortion overlays and noise reduction filters, the result climbed to 96%. The voice on the reel, the one calmly instructing children to repeat phrases about isolation and silence, was almost certainly his. Ellis Granger had been assigned to the Echo Ridge Forestry District between 1987 and 1999. His personnel file, like many from that era, was thin. A few handwritten evaluations, one note about off-grid preferences, a commendation for wildfire response in '92, nothing disciplinary. But in 1999, something changed. He vanished. The official report claimed Granger had failed to check in for 3 consecutive weeks. His last known location had been a fire tower 11 miles from Camp Echo Pines. When the department sent 2 rangers to investigate, they found the tower abandoned, bed made, gear folded, field radio dead. The truck registered to him was found 6 months later over the state line, rusted and stripped. Nobody, no foul play ruled. It was assumed he'd gotten lost, died of exposure. Another quiet statistic in the wilderness. But Gina and the detectives now believed Ellis Granger hadn't disappeared at all. He had retreated. Publicly, the agency had written off his case as another lost hiker. Privately, archived memos painted a different picture. One, dated March 1998, a year after the children vanished, noted that Granger had submitted 2 forged transfer requests, both denied. One proposed building a natural observation center in a remote section of the Echo Ridge sector, land now known to include the buried structure. The requests had been vague. He used terms like long-form preservation study and quiet field cultivation. They sounded like paperwork fillers. But read now, through a different lens, they seemed sinister. Even more disturbing were the building permits. In 1989, Granger had signed off on an unregistered cabin retrofit using scrap materials from a decommissioned ranger outpost. The ledger from the logging company listed nails, timber, and 2 industrial-grade soundproofing rolls. When questioned, Granger had claimed it was for a weather monitoring site. No follow-up was done. The location he listed for construction sat just 2 miles from the ridge where the trapdoor would later be found. Digging deeper, the team uncovered that his medical file had been sealed. It took a court order to access it. What it revealed was a trail of evaluations that never made it into his employment record. In 1983, Granger had been hospitalized briefly after a breakdown at a conservation seminar. He had spoken obsessively about environmental repurification and the psychological repair of early-state trauma through immersion. One note from the attending psychiatrist read, "Displays belief that children, once removed from society and reconditioned in natural isolation, could reset emotionally." He called it the preservation theory. The language mirrored the phrases heard on the reel. "You belong here now." "Quiet" means safe. No one is coming. Granger had never married, no known children. His only sibling died in the late '80s. He lived mostly in ranger housing, kept to himself, and often requested backcountry assignments where contact was minimal. Former colleagues described him as intelligent but off. One recalled him saying, "The trees know more than the courts." Another remembered him being unusually fixated on the children's safety talks given at trailheads, always suggesting edits. More silence, more stillness, less outside influence. It became clear Ellis Granger had not only known about the trapdoor site, he had built it. The cots, the hooks, the food cans, all matched the supply chain timelines from his requisition records. The lantern found underground was identical to a model issued to field staff in 1996. The training books, the survival pamphlets, some bore state-issued stamps tied to forestry educational materials. It hadn't been improvisation. It had been planned. The motive still wasn't clear. Granger had never made demands, never sent letters. There was no manifesto, no cult, no sign he wanted anyone to know what he was doing. But in his world, it wasn't about control. It was about belief. He believed the world was broken, that children were corrupted by noise, pace, and technology, that stripping them down in silence, alone and away, would fix something, maybe them, maybe himself. But one of them resisted. Morgan had vanished from the final footage. Her name was in the notebook, but not in the final lists logged by whoever filmed the reel. And now investigators began to wonder if she had escaped. Had Granger chased her? Did something go wrong? Or had she done what no one else could, defied the man with the ranger patch and disappeared herself? What they did know was this: the hidden structure, the soundproof room, the isolation. It all led back to one man. Ellis Granger, a ranger sworn to protect the forest. And in the end, he used that forest to vanish behind a door he had locked from the inside. The site was officially reopened under federal order on November 2, 2025. A task force composed of forensic anthropologists, cold case investigators, and structural engineers descended on the clearing with one objective: to uncover everything sealed beneath it. The cabin above was stabilized with temporary scaffolding. The trapdoor was reinforced and widened, ground-penetrating radar-mapped subsurface chambers. What they found stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Beneath the room the team had originally entered was another level, deeper, narrower, and sealed behind a false wall made of poured concrete and stone. It had no entry door. The only access came from the ceiling, through a crude hatch that had been welded shut from the outside. When they broke through, they entered a chamber just 8 feet wide and 20 feet long. The air inside was colder than expected, and the smell hit immediately. Along the far wall were 4 small bodies. Each had been wrapped in wool blankets, placed with care. No binding, no signs of visible trauma. The bones were largely intact but degraded. Around them, on the floor, were small objects: 2 bracelets made from twine, a wooden carving shaped like a bear, a torn camp t-shirt, and a photo of the 5 children together. The date on the back matched their arrival at Camp Echo Pines, June 12, 1997. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The DNA matched Brett, Kayla, Josh, and Tyler. The 5th child, Morgan Menard, the one who had refused to speak on camera, the one who vanished between shots, was not among them. A timeline began to form. The children had been kept alive in the underground rooms for over a year. Nutrition analysis suggested gradual malnutrition, not starvation. Trace evidence indicated basic hygiene products, likely rationed. There were no signs of restraint, but based on journal entries and environmental data, experts concluded the children likely died between late 1998 and early 1999. The most likely causes: infection, respiratory illness, or hypothermia. No medical equipment was found. No attempt had been made to preserve their remains beyond basic burial. Whoever had left them there had done so with intention, but not cruelty. At least, not by traditional standards. One anthropologist referred to it as ritualized detachment, an obsessive self-contained belief system carried out to its conclusion. They had not been killed violently. They had simply been left. Investigators now believed Ellis Granger fled the site sometime in the spring of 1999, the same year his truck was found, stripped and abandoned across the state line. The same year his name was quietly removed from ranger directories. It's likely he knew the end was coming. Media pressure around the Echo Pines case had spiked again that winter. His structure, hidden for over a decade, had become too dangerous to maintain. But the question that remained, unchanged and unanswered, was Morgan. There was no blood, no remains, no trace of her ever occupying the sealed chamber. Only the footage showed her, alive, resistant, then gone. One entry in the notebook, dated weeks before the others fell silent, read simply, "She tried the stairs again. He got angry." Then nothing more. Search teams combed the area surrounding the cabin, extending 5 miles in every direction. No bones, no clothing, no trail. But they did find something, an old emergency kit buried in a plastic container a mile north. Inside were 3 granola bars, a water pouch, a folded flannel shirt, and a single camp ID tag, scratched nearly unreadable, but still intact enough to make out the first name, Morgan. It was enough to change the case status. Instead of listing all 5 children as deceased, the FBI updated the file. 4 confirmed, 1 undetermined. Morgan Menard's status was changed to missing, presumed escaped. The memorial service was held 1 month later. Simple, private, families, close friends, and a handful of locals who had searched the woods in 1997. A plaque was placed near the clearing. It read only, "For the 5 who were lost, no names, no dates, just a silence that finally had a shape." But the case, even closed, refused to rest. Investigators were haunted by how long it took to find the truth. How close they had come in the early days. How Granger had outsmarted their searches using knowledge only someone who lived with the trees would have. Former rangers returned to review their own maps, some breaking down in tears. The guilt was quiet, but deep. Gina never published a final blog entry. She said the story wasn't hers to end, but she left one note at the site, tucked beneath a stone near the trap door. It read, "You were never gone. We just couldn't hear you." The cabin has since been sealed, not destroyed, preserved as evidence. Visits are restricted. Entry requires federal clearance. But the story lives on, in classrooms, in training seminars, in every missing persons case where wandered off isn't enough anymore. And Morgan's photo is still pinned to a bulletin board in Duluth, next to a dozen others marked "Missing but Not Forgotten." She'd be 37 now. No one knows if she died in those woods or if she got far enough to lose the trail behind her. But they do know she tried, that she resisted, that something in her wouldn't repeat the words, wouldn't let silence win. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, the girl who vanished twice is still walking, still unseen, still surviving in the last place anyone thought to look.